What if you found a campsite where everything suggests people were there literally seconds ago, but they simply vanished without taking anything essential, without shoes, even leaving food cooking over an active campfire, where the tent is perfectly pitched, sleeping bags still warm, expensive equipment scattered as if the owners had just gotten up to get something and would be back in a moment. But nobody is there, and cries for help echo through the forest without any answer. This happened. It's meticulously documented, and it defies all logic about how and why rational adults would abandon the safety of an established campsite so abruptly and inexplicably. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover goes beyond the common mystery of missing persons. We're talking about a scene that experienced park rangers who have seen literally hundreds of campsites throughout their careers have described as one of the most disturbing they've ever witnessed. Imagine arriving at a designated camping area in a national park, expecting perhaps to find campers needing medical assistance or help with equipment, and instead finding something that seems straight out of fiction but is absolutely unquestionably real. A campfire actively burning with crisp flames, licking freshly added wood. A pot of water boiling over a flame so vigorously that it was almost completely evaporated. Food laid out, as if someone were in the middle of preparing breakfast and was interrupted. And then, as you examine the scene more carefully, as you catalogue every detail trying to understand what happened, you find an element that transforms the strange scene into something genuinely terrifying. 3 pairs of hiking shoes, not casually thrown aside but carefully lined up side by side outside the tent entrance, as if they had been deliberately removed and arranged intentionally before their owners went barefoot into the dense pine forest, the ground covered in sharp needles, branches and rocks that hurt feet, even when shod just a few meters away. Have you ever stopped to think about what would need to happen to make you leave camp safely without shoes, without a phone, without a wallet, without anything you would take if you were planning to be gone for more than minutes? And not just you, but 2 other adults making the exact same decision simultaneously, all silently agreeing to line up shoes, leave the campfire burning, a serious violation of safety, rules, and simply leave. Where to? Why? And more importantly, why did they never return when the obvious intention, based on everything left behind, was to come back in moments? This is the true story of 3 friends who went camping in Sequoia National Park in August 2018. Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres, and Ryan Cooper. Real people with families who loved them, with established lives, with future plans. They entered that park following all the correct protocols, experienced campers, well prepared, excited for a trip they had planned for months. And at some point during the 3rd morning of their trip, something happened. Something that made them make a collective decision that violates every human instinct for self-preservation, all logic, all rationality. When forest rangers arrived at the campsite in response to a concerned report from other hikers who had stumbled upon the scene, their first thought was that perhaps people had gone out for a quick morning walk and would be back soon. But as minutes ticked by, as they called out Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan's names aloud through the woods without response, as they examined evidence of a campfire that had been kept burning for hours, signifying someone had fed overnight, as they realized the extent of essential items left behind, an inescapable realization began to sink in. Something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. And what you'll discover as we delve deeper into this case may completely change how you think about safety in national parks, about the trust we place in our own rationality and instincts, and about the possibility that there are phenomena, whether natural or otherwise, that can compel human behavior in ways that our current science doesn't adequately understand. Because this isn't an isolated story of 3 people making bizarre decisions for reasons unique to them. It's part of a broader pattern of abandoned campsites found in similar circumstances across multiple national parks over decades, a pattern rarely discussed publicly but known and deeply troubling to search and rescue professionals. Have you ever had a camping experience where you felt an inexplicable compulsion to leave the area or a profound discomfort for no obvious reason? Where something about the environment, perhaps a sound you couldn't identify or a sensation you couldn't articulate, made every instinct scream at you to move, to get out, to go in any direction other than that one? Keep that feeling in. Mind as we explore what may have happened to Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan that morning in Sequoia. Because before we delve into the disturbing details of what was found at that campsite, before we examine the massive search that followed and the impossible twist the case eventually took, you need to know who these three people were. Not as missing person statistics, not as a mystery to be solved, but as real humans with relationships, dreams, and specific reasons why that trip was important to them. Before we get to know Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan as real people, I need to ask you something that will make all the difference. If you've ever had a camping experience where something made you feel you needed to leave the area immediately, where you heard inexplicable sounds or felt deep discomfort for no apparent reason, leave a comment describing what happened. Because what may seem like just a strange moment or a passing sensation could actually be an important piece in a larger pattern we're trying to understand. Each account that emerges here helps to map whether there are natural phenomena or specific circumstances that affect people in ways that science hasn't yet adequately studied. And you know what? Your participation here, every comment you leave, every story you share, is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who need to know these stories. These aren't just intriguing cases for entertainment. They're real lessons about human behavior in extreme situations, about the limits of our understanding of national parks we visit, about the importance of paying attention to instincts and warning signs that we normally dismiss as irrational. So if this type of content makes sense to you, if you value investigations that treat real mysteries with the seriousness and respect they deserve, leave a like on this video. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time. Click that subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week we explore cases of disappearances in national parks that are meticulously documented but defy conventional explanation. You're not just a viewer here, you're part of this community of people who want to understand uncomfortable truths about the places we visit, who recognize that there's much more going on than tour guides admit. Now, with you by my side in this investigation, we're going to get to know who Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan really were. Because before they were a mystery, before they were an impossible abandoned campsite, they were people with full lives, deep relationships, and a trip that represented an important moment in their journeys. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because before we talk about the impossible abandoned campsite and the desperate search that followed, you need to know who Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres, and Ryan Cooper really were. Not as anonymous victims or missing persons statistics, but as real, vibrant people who woke up every day with routines, who had inside jokes among friends, who made plans for the future, and who were deeply loved by families who never imagined that a 5-day camping trip would turn into a nightmare that continues to this day. Because when you understand who they were, the mystery of what happened becomes much more personal, much more urgent, and the impossibility of their decisions that morning gains an emotional weight that facts alone could never convey. Aaron Fletcher was 32 years old when he disappeared in August 2018. He was a software engineer working for a tech startup in San Francisco, the kind of person colleagues describe as the guy who always has a solution for complex technical problems. But Aaron wasn't the stereotypical programmer who lives only in a digital world. He had a deep passion for nature that he had developed since childhood when his father took him hiking in the mountains around Oregon where he grew up. Aaron maintained a blog about hiking and camping where he shared routes, equipment tips, and philosophical reflections on the value of disconnecting from technology and reconnecting with wilderness. His last posts before his disappearance were about preparing for a trip to Sequoia, palpable excitement about showing Melissa one of the places he loved most. Aaron's transformation from a casual outdoor enthusiast into an experienced and responsible camper had been a journey of over 15 years. He wasn't the type of person to grab a backpack on a whim and head out into the woods without a plan. He had a detailed checklist that he religiously followed before each trip, obsessively checked weather, forecasts, studied trail maps for hours, and always informed multiple people of exactly where he would be and when he should return. In the case of the Sequoia trip, Aaron had registered his presence at the park's visitor center as proper protocol dictated, had filled out a detailed form indicating that the trio would be camping in a specific designated area called Wolverton, and had left information with his younger brother about the planned route and expected return date of August 22nd. Melissa Torres, Aaron's 29-year-old girlfriend, was a nurse working in a hospital emergency unit in San Francisco. It was a stressful and emotionally draining job, dealing with trauma and human suffering daily. And Melissa often spoke about how time in nature was essential for her mental health and ability to continue doing work she loved. She had met Aaron 2 years prior through a mutual friend at a social event, and the connection had been immediate and deep, partly based on a shared love of outdoor adventures. Melissa was described by friends as a caring and pragmatic person, traits that served her well in the nursing profession and made her an ideal camping partner because she always thought about safety and preparation. Melissa's mindset regarding camping was one of balance between appreciating the beauty and adventure of wilderness and maintaining a constant awareness of risks and the need for precautions. She kept a comprehensive first aid kit that she took on every trip, had completed a wilderness medicine course specifically to be prepared for emergencies in remote areas, and made a habit of checking that everyone in the group had enough water, sunscreen, and appropriate layers of clothing. She was exactly the kind of person you'd want around if something went wrong, ironically making what eventually happened all the more inexplicable. Ryan Cooper, Aaron's 33-year-old best friend, completed the trio. They had met in college, roommates who discovered an immediate affinity and maintained a close friendship for over a decade since graduation. Ryan was a history teacher at a high school in Oakland, the kind of teacher students remember decades later because he brought the past to life through genuine enthusiasm and an ability to connect historical events to the contemporary lives of teenagers. Ryan had a dry sense of humor that balanced Aaron's sometimes overly serious personality and had developed a close relationship with Melissa. Haswell, genuinely happy that his best friend had found such a compatible partner. Ryan's impact on the trio's dynamic was to bring lightness and humor, but also intellectual depth. He loved campfire conversations at night that would begin with trivial topics, but drift into philosophical discussions about life, meaning and the nature of reality. Aaron would describe in his blog how these moments of deep conversation under the stars, far from the distractions of modern life, were an essential part of why he valued camping trips with close friends so much. There was a sense of authenticity and connection that was difficult to replicate in the normal urban contexts of their lives. The journey that took the trio specifically to Sequoia National Park that August of 2018 had been planned for months. Aaron had visited Sequoia multiple times before and wanted to share the experience of walking among giant trees that were thousands of years old, a prospect that always made him feel simultaneously humble and connected to something greater than himself. Melissa had never been to Sequoia and was excited to see giant sequoias that she had only seen in photos. Ryan was particularly interested in the historical aspect of the park. He wanted to visit areas where early conservationists like John Muir had walked and written about, connecting his personal love for nature with his professional interest in history. The trio had rented additional camping equipment they didn't own, purchased carefully planned food supplies for 5 days, and even done practice hikes in a local state park weeks beforehand to ensure everyone was in appropriate physical condition. They weren't reckless adventurers seeking adrenaline through risk. They were responsible adults engaging in recreational activity they had done multiple variations of, with preparation exceeding what most people would do. The truth about their last communication with the outside world before disappearing is preserved in a photo Aaron posted on Instagram on the evening of August 20th, the second night of their trip. The image shows the three of them sitting around a crackling campfire, flames illuminating their faces in a warm golden hue. Genuine and relaxed smiles that speak of people enjoying exactly the kind of experience they had hoped for. The caption Aaron wrote simply read, "Second day in Sequoia, fresh air, good friends, zero cell phone coverage, exactly what we needed." There were 17 comments from friends and family saying things like, "Looks amazing, have fun, come back safe." No one had any reason to worry. Everything about the trip up to that point had been completely normal and even ideal. That photo, when you look at it now knowing what would happen in approximately 12 hours, takes on an astonishing quality. You look for signs, any indication of tension or worry or premonition of imminent danger, but there is nothing. Just three happy friends enjoying nature, exactly as they had planned. And then the next morning, August 21st, something happened. Something that made them abandon that safe campsite where they had spent comfortable nights, leaving behind not only equipment, but shoes, phones, everything a rational person would take if they were going out for any length of time, and walk barefoot into the dense forest without leaving a note, without shouting for help detectable by other campers in the area, without any explanation that makes sense to rational minds trying to reconstruct events. Comment below, real people, if you feel a connection to Aaron, Melissa and Ryan as individuals with full lives, making the mystery of their disappearance not only intriguing, but deeply tragic for everyone who loved them. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the morning of August 21st, 2018 began completely normally for a hiking couple named David and Linda Martinez, who were doing a popular trail through the Wolverton area in Sequoia. They had started hiking early, around 6:30 in the morning, enjoying the morning coolness before the August sun heated the trail. And as they walked, appreciating the silence of the forest, broken only by the occasional sounds of birds and their own footsteps, David noticed something that caught his attention in a way that he initially couldn't articulate, because it seemed strange. There was smoke, a thin, steady column rising through the trees, coming from the direction of one of the designated camping areas, approximately 100 meters off the main trail. The transformation from casual observation to concern began when David mentioned smoke to Linda, and they both stopped to consider. There was something about the timing that seemed off. It was approximately 7:15 a.m., a time that seemed far too early for a breakfast campfire to be burning so vigorously as to produce visible smoke from a distance. Most campers would either still be asleep at that hour or just beginning to wake up, and a typical morning cooking campfire would be smaller, more controlled, not producing substantial smoke, and there was a constant, heavy quality to the smoke that suggested not just embers from the previous night's campfire still smoldering, but a fire, actively burning with fresh fuel. David and Linda exchanged a glance that silent communication couples develop, assessing whether they should check. Their initial instinct was that it was probably nothing, perhaps just campers who had woken up earlier than usual and were making an elaborate breakfast. But there was also the possibility that something was wrong, that perhaps a campfire had been accidentally left unattended and was at risk of spreading, or that campers needed help in some way. Linda, who had paramedic training, leaned in to check just to be sure, so the trio decided to briefly detour off the trail and see if everything was all right. David's mindset as they approached the campsite was one of expecting to find a perfectly normal scene that would explain the smoke. Perhaps a family with young children who had woken up early and whose parents were making elaborate pancakes or something similar. But as the vegetation opened up and the campsite became visible, his first impression was that something was immediately and profoundly wrong, even before processing specific details. It was a visceral feeling that preceded rational analysis, a kind of instinctive alarm that evolution gave us to detect danger or anomaly. The impact of actually seeing the scene hit in layers as my brain processed contradictory information. There was a campfire, and not dying embers, but an active fire with flames 15 to 20 centimeters high, licking wood, crackling audibly even, from several meters away. There were 3 or 4 substantial logs arranged in a configuration that any experienced camper would recognize as an intentional arrangement to keep the fire burning for an extended period, not just a quick cooking fire. And on top of the fire was a metal pot, water inside boiling so vigorously that steam was rising in clouds, and the water level had dropped drastically, indicating that it had been boiling for a considerable time. There was a tent, a large 3-person model perfectly pitched in a flat area designated for camping. The tent's entrance door was partially open, and through the opening, David could see 3 sleeping bags arranged inside, 2 side by side and 1 perpendicular, a configuration that suggested people had slept there and recently left. There were backpacks, 3 of them, neatly arranged near the tent entrance. There was a bear-proof food storage container, properly closed, indicating that campers knew and followed safety protocols. Camping equipment was scattered in a way that suggested active use, not chaotic abandonment, but an organic arrangement of people living in the space for a few days. But there were no people. Absolutely no one was visible in the campsite or the immediately surrounding area. David called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" in a loud but friendly tone, the kind he would use to announce his presence to neighboring campers without startling them. No answer. Linda joined in, calling out, "Do you need help? Is everything all right?" Silence except for the crackling of fire and the fervor of boiling water. David and Linda exchanged glances again, this time of genuine concern mixed with growing confusion. The journey through the next few minutes as they examined the camp more closely revealed details that transformed the strange into genuinely disturbing. Linda, with medical training, approached the tent to check if there might be sick or injured people inside who couldn't respond. Peeking through an open entrance, she confirmed the tent was empty except for equipment. But sleeping bags were still in their configuration, as if people had just gotten out of them. One of the bags was partially turned upside down, as if someone had hurriedly gotten out. But there were no signs of struggle or distress, just an inexplicable absence of occupants. David observed the campfire more closely, and his own camping experience told him something crucial. The firewood arranged there wasn't something that would burn for hours without intervention. Someone had added those logs recently, probably at the last minute, maybe even more recently. A campfire doesn't maintain a burning flame like that without fresh fuel being added periodically, which meant that whoever was camping there had started a fire very recently and then simply left without extinguishing the fire, a serious violation of safety rules in a national park, without removing the pot that was boiling dry and could eventually melt or start a bigger problem. The disturbing truth that was emerging was that the scene suggested a sudden interruption of normal morning activities, as if people were awake, keeping a fire going, boiling water presumably for coffee or oatmeal, preparing for a day of hiking. And then something happened that made them abruptly leave the campsite without even taking a moment to deal with an active fire or a boiling pot. But what? And where did they go? And why were there no signs of panic or struggle? And then Linda noticed a detail that transformed the perplexing mystery into something genuinely terrifying. Near the tent entrance, carefully aligned side by side with a precision that suggested intentional arrangement, were 3 pairs of hiking shoes. Not casually tossed aside as shoes typically are when removed at the end of the day, but positioned in an almost military fashion, each pair perfectly parallel to the others. Linda pointed to David, and for a moment they both simply stared at the shoes, trying to process the implication. People camping in the woods don't go out without shoes, they simply don't. Forest floor is covered in pine needles, small branches, rocks, not to mention the possibility of encountering wildlife or dangerous terrain. Bare feet in the wilderness is a recipe for injury in minutes. The impact of this discovery on David and Linda was the immediate decision that whatever was happening was beyond their capacity to handle and required authorities. Linda used the emergency whistle she was carrying, 3 short bursts being the universal signal of distress, hoping that perhaps camp occupants were nearby and would respond. Silence. David approached the fire carefully and used a long branch to move the boiling pot out of direct flames, not wanting to extinguish the fire completely in case it was important evidence, but also not wanting to leave a potentially dangerous situation unmitigated. And so David and Linda decided to leave that area quickly and find a park ranger. There was something about camping that made them both deeply uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the mystery of where people were, it was a feeling that the scene was wrong in ways that violated fundamental expectations about rational human behavior. And as they left, walking quickly back to the main trail and then practically running towards the nearest visitor center, they both shared an unspoken sense of relief at leaving that place, as if instinct was telling them that whatever had made 3 people abandon camp so strangely was something they didn't want to encounter either. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because when forest rangers arrived at the campsite within 90 minutes of David and Linda's report, their first action was to meticulously catalogue every item present at the scene. And as the inventory grew, as every detail was documented and photographed, The impossibility of what had happened became progressively more pronounced, because we're not talking about a campsite that was abandoned in a way that suggests an emergency evacuation or escape from an immediate threat. We're talking about a scene that in almost every aspect suggests a temporary interruption of normal activities, except for the glaring and inexplicable absences, the deliberately removed shoes, and the three people who should have been there. The shoes themselves deserved special attention because their arrangement communicated something important about the mindset of the people who removed them. These weren't three pairs casually tossed aside in a haphazard configuration, as you'd see if people had hastily kicked shoes away. They were quality hiking boots, each pair carefully aligned, almost obsessively, side by side in a perfectly straight line, approximately half a meter from the tent entrance. Aaron's boots were men's size 10, a specific model from the Merrill brand that he had mentioned on his blog as having worn for years and completely trusted. Melissa's boots were women's size 7 from the Salomon brand, relatively new based on minimal solewear. Ryan's boots were size 11 from the Keen brand. Each pair still had its laces tied, not loose as they would be if they had been quickly removed, but tied in a way that suggested they had been taken off methodically. The transformation from observing lined-up shoes to understanding their implications was immediate for Ranger Patricia Morrison, the first responder to arrive at the scene. Patricia had over 15 years of experience in Sequoia and had seen literally hundreds of campsites throughout her career, and she had never seen a setup like that. Shoes removed and left outside the tent was normal. Many campers do this to avoid bringing dirt and moisture inside. But people who remove shoes to enter a tent are usually then in the tent, or if they left temporarily, they would put their shoes back on before walking through the woods. The only interpretation of the scene was that the trio had removed their shoes, carefully lined them up, and then intentionally walked barefoot. And that simply doesn't make sense within any framework of rational human behavior in wilderness. Patricia instructed the team not to disturb the scene more than necessary while photographing and documenting everything. Then she began a systematic inventory of everything present. Inside the three backpacks she found cell phones. Aaron's iPhone was completely out of battery. Melissa's Android was turned off but had 53% charge when turned on later. Ryan's phone had 16% battery. When the phones were examined, they revealed nothing unusual. Last activity was from the previous night. Aaron had checked email one last time before coverage disappeared completely. Melissa had texted her mother saying, "Everything's great here, no signal but deer." Ryan had taken pictures of the sunset. Everything absolutely normal. The investigators' mindset upon finding the phones left behind was one of confusion, because in the modern age, people rarely go anywhere without phones, even knowing they won't have a signal. Phones serve as cameras, as offline GPS devices if maps have been downloaded, as a light source via flashlight, and as a way to call emergency services if they happen to find an area with a signal. Leaving phones behind suggested that the trio expected to return to camp very quickly, within minutes, not hours. But if it was such a brief departure, why remove shoes? People don't walk barefoot, even for minutes in the forest, unless they have an extremely compelling reason. Wallets belonging to all three were found. Aaron and Ryan had wallets in the side pockets of their backpacks, and Melissa had a small wallet in an inside zipper of her backpack. Aaron's wallet contained $142 in cash, credit cards, a driver's license, and a health insurance card. Melissa's wallet had $85, her cards, and IDs. Ryan's wallet had $63 and similar documents. Car keys for the Toyota 4Runner that the trio had rented for the trip were in Aaron's backpack along with rental documents. Absolutely nothing that someone planning to leave the area permanently or expecting to be away for an extended period would leave behind. The impact of finding expensive equipment added a layer of mystery. There was a top-of-the-line Garmin handheld GPS device costing $400, perfect for hiking. There were 2 pairs of high-quality binoculars for wildlife observation. There was a Canon DSLR camera with a lens that alone was worth over $1,000. There was even a GoPro that Ryan had brought to capture footage of the trails. All this equipment, representing an investment of thousands of dollars, simply left unprotected at the campsite. People don't abandon equipment like that unless they have a clear intention to return to retrieve it. Analysis of the campfire and food area revealed a specific timeline of morning activities. There was evidence that coffee was being prepared. A pour-over coffee filter was positioned over a mug, the filter still containing coffee grounds, but water had never been poured through it. There were oats in individual packages that had been opened and emptied into bowls. 3 bowls lined up near the fire awaiting hot water for preparation. There were dried fruits and nuts that had been arranged as toppings. Everything suggested the preparation of a typical breakfast that was in progress when something interrupted it. The journey through the clothing inventory was equally unsettling. Inside the tent there were 3 sets of extra clothes neatly folded and organized. Aaron had brought a heavy fleece and waterproof jacket. Melissa had brought multiple layers, including a down vest, which would be essential for cold nights at altitude. Ryan had a rain jacket and an extra sweater, all appropriate for mountain conditions where temperatures could drop dramatically after sunset, and all left behind, suggesting that when the trio set out, they didn't expect to be out in cold weather, nor were they planning an extensive expedition. There was also a comprehensive first aid kit that Melissa had brought, containing everything from band-aids to emergency prescription medication. There was an emergency whistle that each person carried as standard safety protocol. All 3 whistles found in backpacks or attached to zippers. There were detailed trail maps of the area, laminated and with planned routes marked with a highlighter marker. There was a flashlight for each person with working batteries. Literally every item a person in wilderness would need for safety and navigation was present and left behind. The uncomfortable truth that emerged from meticulous inventory was that the scene didn't fit into any logical narrative researchers could construct. If the trio had fled immediate danger, such as a bear or threatening person, they wouldn't have stopped to carefully line up their shoes. If they were leaving voluntarily, planning not to return, they would have taken at least identification documents, money, and phones. If they were confused or disoriented for some medical reason, such as carbon monoxide poisoning or another gas, they wouldn't have been able to execute a coordinated action of all removing shoes and lining them up in an organized manner. If they were responding to an emergency, such as hearing someone else's cry for help, they would have kept their shoes on and taken a first aid kit. Patricia Morrison, coordinating the initial analysis, made a note in a report that would later be cited in multiple analyses of the case. Scene suggests interruption of routine activities, but the specific nature of items left behind, particularly the deliberate removal and alignment of footwear, indicates a conscious decision rather than a panic flight. Motivation for the decision remains completely opaque. Observed behavior does not fit any established pattern of human response to emergency, threat, or psychological distress that I am familiar with through years of experience in search and rescue operations. It was an honest admission from an experienced professional that she was confronting something outside her experience or understanding. And while the inventory continued, while each item was catalogued and each photo was taken, documenting the scene exactly as it was found, an active search for Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan was already underway, with teams being mobilized to scour the surrounding forest looking for any sign of where the barefoot trio might have gone. Comment below, everything is left behind, if you understand that physical evidence at the camp tells the story of people who clearly expected to return within minutes, making their permanent disappearance even more impossible to reconcile. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the response to the disappearance of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan was a perfect textbook example of how search and rescue operations should work when executed with maximum precision and urgency. There was no bureaucratic hesitation, no wasted time debating whether the situation was serious enough to mobilize full resources, no errors in judgment that could have compromised the chances of finding the trio quickly. And yet, despite everything being done exactly right, despite the response being a model of professional efficiency, Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan remained impossible to locate. And when you understand how quick and coordinated the operation was, the failure to find any trace of them becomes even more disconcerting and deeply disturbing. Patricia Morrison, who had arrived on the scene as the first responder, made an instant assessment upon seeing an abandoned campsite with shoes lined up and a still burning campfire. This was a maximum level emergency. She immediately used her radio to activate full search and rescue protocol for 3 adults missing under highly suspicious circumstances. The suspicious circumstances classification was critical because it mobilized not only park rangers, but also specialized volunteer search and rescue teams that maintained standby lists for exactly this type of situation. Within 20 minutes of Patricia's initial call, a command operation was being established, resources were being mobilized, and a search plan was being formulated. The transformation of a tranquil wilderness area into an intensive operations center happened with impressive speed. Additional park rangers arrived from multiple sections of the park, some driving for over an hour to respond. A local volunteer search and rescue team, a group of 23 people specifically trained in wilderness search techniques, was activated and began arriving within hours. A helicopter was requested from its base in Fresno and was en route, with an estimated time of arrival of 90 minutes. The area around the campsite was immediately surrounded in the sense that people were positioned at strategic points along surrounding trails and roads to intercept Aaron, Melissa, or Ryan, should they wander off and emerge from the woods. Patricia's mindset when organizing the initial search was twofold. First, to operate under the premise that the trio was alive and possibly injured or lost within reasonable proximity of their campsite, because this premise demanded maximum urgency and maximum resources. Second, not to make assumptions about what had happened that would limit the scope of the search too early. So even though the obvious scenario was that the trio had gone for a morning walk and something had gone wrong, Patricia instructed teams to also look for signs of foul play, a catastrophic accident, or any other possibility that could explain their disappearance. The initial search teams were organized into groups of 4 people each, a configuration that balanced efficient ground coverage with the safety of the searchers themselves. Each team was assigned a specific sector defined by GPS coordinates and geographical features such as streams or rock formations. The search pattern was concentric circles expanding from the campsite, an established technique based on the statistical probability that lost people are usually found in the vicinity of their last known location. The first wave of the search covered a radius of 500 meters from the campsite, an area that a person walking could cover in less than 10 minutes, even barefoot. The impact of the first 2 hours of intensive searching was absolutely nothing. Teams reported back to Central Command with frustrating consistency. North sector searched, no sign. East sector complete, nothing found. South sector cleared. Searchers were constantly shouting Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan's names as they walked, looking for any response or sound of movement. They were carefully scouring vegetation, looking for flashes of clothing color, for plant disturbances that would indicate recent passage, for any physical evidence of human presence. They were checking behind large trees, around rock formations, in small ravines. Anywhere an injured person might be lying unconscious or someone trying to take shelter might be hiding. There was a fundamental logical problem that was bothering everyone involved in the search. Why would the trio go out barefoot? Patricia returned to this question repeatedly because she simply couldn't construct a scenario that made sense. If they had seen or heard something that alarmed them, the natural response would have been to quickly grab shoes and investigate, not deliberately remove shoes and align them before leaving. If they were responding to a medical emergency of some kind, one of them having a heart attack or sudden injury, the other 2 would have kept their shoes on and probably grabbed a first aid kit. If they were experiencing some kind of collective psychotic episode or intoxication affecting judgment, they wouldn't have been able to execute the coordinated and organized action of precisely aligning their shoes. The journey through possible hypotheses was an exercise in eliminating options one by one because none fit the evidence completely. The theory that the trio had gone out to watch the sunrise and got lost, but sunrise had been at 6:12 that morning, and evidence at the campfire and breakfast preparation suggested activity began well after that, probably around 7. And experienced hikers like Aaron don't get lost walking a short distance in an area where they had already camped for 2 days. The theory of an animal attack? But there was no blood at the campsite, no signs of a struggle, and bears or cougars don't convince 3 adults to calmly remove their shoes before attacking. The theory of kidnapping? But there were no Footprints of additional people, no signs of vehicles having been in the area. And how could a kidnapper control 3 healthy adults simultaneously without an evident struggle? As the sun rose and the temperature increased, the urgency of the search intensified because anyone walking barefoot in forest terrain would be accumulating foot injuries that would progressively limit mobility. Human feet without the protection of footwear suffer damage quickly on forest floor. Cuts from rocks and branches, punctures from pine needles, and even the possibility of infection if injuries are not treated. If Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan were wandering lost, their physical condition would be deteriorating with each passing hour. The truth about the helicopter when it arrived around midday was that it offered a new perspective, but similarly frustrating results. The pilot made multiple passes at varying altitudes over the area surrounding the camp, using both visual observation and a thermal camera to search for heat signatures of human bodies. Forest canopy severely limited visibility in many areas, but where there were clearings or less dense vegetation, the helicopter offered the advantage of being able to cover ground much more quickly than searchers on foot. Hours of flight time were dedicated, with trained observers looking for any anomaly, any flash of color, any movement. The thermal camera was particularly useful in theory because living human bodies produce a distinct heat, signature that can be detected through moderate vegetation. But thermal scans revealed nothing that appeared human, only occasional wildlife such as deer or other smaller animals. The psychological impact on search teams as the day progressed without any discovery was one of growing frustration mixed with deep concern. Experienced searchers know that the first 24 hours are absolutely critical in search operations because the window of survival for missing persons, especially if injured or exposed, decreases dramatically after that, and they had begun searching within just a few hours of the likely disappearance, a time advantage that should have meant a high probability of success. But as evening turned to night and light began to fade, forcing the decision to suspend active searching until dawn for the safety of the searchers themselves, the trio remained as mysteriously missing as when the operation had begun. Patricia Morrison, in an end-of-day briefing with teams, was honest about the perplexing situation. We covered more than 5 square kilometers today, systematically and completely. We had more than 50 people on the ground, we had air support, we had ideal weather conditions, and we found no trace of Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres or Ryan Cooper. No clear footprints beyond those immediately around the camp. No pieces of clothing, no sign that they passed through the area we searched. Tomorrow we expand the search even further, bring in sniffer dogs, and continue until we find answers. But in her tone of voice there was a note of unease that experienced veterans recognized. This was not following normal patterns, and no one had a satisfactory explanation as to why. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because as night fell over Sequoia on that first day, and search teams temporarily withdrew to rest before resuming at dawn, Patricia Morrison and other operation leaders gathered to assess what they knew and to develop working theories about what might have happened. And when you examine each theory they considered, when you see how meticulously they tried to fit evidence into known explanations of how people disappear in national parks, you realize that the case of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan defies neat categorization. Every possible theory has elements that make sense, but also fundamental aspects that simply don't fit, leaving investigators in the frustrating position of not being able to rule anything out completely, but also not being able to embrace any explanation with confidence. The first theory that naturally arises in any disappearance in the wilderness is a wild animal attack. Sequoia is habitat for black bears and, occasionally, cougars, both predators that theoretically could pose a threat to humans. So the team considered the possibility that the trio had left camp and encountered a bear or cougar that attacked. But immediately, multiple problems with this theory became apparent. First and most obvious, there was no blood in the camp or in the immediately surrounding area. Bear or cougar attacks are violent events that leave substantial evidence of trauma, blood on vegetation or ground, pieces of torn clothing, signs of a struggle. Teams had meticulously searched the area and found nothing of the sort. Second problem with the animal attack theory: people confronted by a dangerous predator don't calmly remove their shoes and align them precisely before the encounter. If the trio had seen the bear from a distance and tried to flee, they would have kept their shoes on for maximum mobility. If the bear had appeared suddenly and surprised them, there wouldn't have been time for the deliberate removal of footwear. And third problem, bear or puma attacks rarely result in multiple victims being completely removed from the scene without leaving any trace. Even in scenarios where an animal kills a person and drags the body, there is a trail of evidence that can be followed. But searchers had found no trail of dragging, no signs of a large predator in the area, nothing to suggest the involvement of dangerous wildlife. The shift from an animal attack theory to a theory of witnessing. Something disturbing stemmed from attempts to explain why the trio would have left camp so abruptly. Perhaps some investigators speculated Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan had witnessed a crime being committed, maybe a drug operation or illegal hunter, and whoever was involved threatened or chased them, forcing them to flee. But this theory also had significant problems. The area where they were camping was relatively populated. It wasn't remote, isolated wilderness where criminal activity would be likely. And most importantly, there was no evidence of other people having been in the area. Forensic teams had carefully examined the terrain around the campsite, looking for additional footprints, off-road vehicle tire tracks, or any sign of human presence beyond the trio. Nothing was found. Even if we accept that the trio had encountered something or someone threatening, the theory doesn't explain the lined-up shoes. People fleeing in panic don't stop to arrange their footwear with military precision. The act of removing and lining up shoes suggests a deliberate and calm mindset, not a fear response to an immediate threat. So the panic flight theory simply doesn't fit the physical evidence from the scene. The mindset of some more skeptical investigators led them to consider the kidnapping theory. Perhaps an unknown person or group had arrived at the campsite, had somehow controlled Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan, and forced them to leave without their belongings. But the logistics of kidnapping 3 healthy adults simultaneously is extremely difficult, even for multiple well-armed and organized perpetrators. And how would a kidnapper explain the fact that the trio had voluntarily removed their shoes? You can force people to leave a campsite under threat of a weapon, but it would be much more difficult to make them perform the specific action of removing shoes and lining them up without creating a disturbance that would leave evidence. And there's a geographical problem with the kidnapping theory. How did the perpetrators get to the campsite? There were no direct access roads to the area. It would have required a walk of at least 45 minutes along the nearest trail accessible by vehicle. So the kidnapper would have had to walk to the area, find the trio, somehow control them without audible or visible struggle for other campers in the region, and then take them back through the forest, all without leaving footprints or evidence of passage. This scenario is theoretically possible, but implausible to the point of near practical impossibility. The impact of considering a suicide pact or planned escape theory stemmed from the need to explore all possibilities, no matter how improbable. Perhaps, some suggested, the trio had planned to disappear voluntarily, perhaps to start new lives or to commit collective suicide in a remote location. But this theory failed even the most basic scrutiny. First, there was absolutely no indication in Aaron, Melissa, or Ryan's lives of mental health problems, suicidal ideation, or motivation to disappear. Aaron was thriving in his career, having just received a promotion. Melissa loved her job and had a close relationship with her family. Ryan was excited about the school year that was about to begin. And critically, people planning to disappear permanently would take identification documents and money, exactly the things the trio had left behind. You can't start a new life without ID. You can't access bank funds. You can't do literally anything in modern society without documentation. And if it was collective suicide, why choose the method of walking barefoot into the forest? And why keep a campfire burning and leave food being prepared, elements that suggest an intention to return? The theory simply doesn't make sense when confronted with physical evidence and the trio's personal histories. The journey through these theories revealed a fundamental and frustrating truth. Every conventional explanation of how people disappear in the wilderness fails to accommodate the specific combination of elements present in the case of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan. An actively burning campfire with freshly added wood doesn't fit a scenario of animal attack or sudden abduction. Food in the middle of preparation doesn't fit a planned escape or suicide. Shoes removed and carefully aligned don't fit a panicked escape or emergency response, and a total absence of evidence of where they went, despite intensive searches, doesn't fit virtually any scenario where 3 adults walking barefoot should leave detectable footprints and be locatable within a reasonable search area. Patricia Morrison expressed growing frustration in case notes she kept. Each individual element of this scene would make sense in some context. An unattended campfire could indicate a hasty departure. Removed shoes could indicate preparation to enter a tent or cross a stream. A lack of traces in the search area could indicate they went further than we anticipated. But the combination of all these elements simultaneously, along with the absence of any logical explanation for the decisions the trio made, creates a puzzle I cannot solve using the framework of decades of experience in search and rescue. There was also consideration of more exotic explanations that some team members mentioned, but with appropriate hesitation. Could there have been a natural phenomenon affecting the trio's judgment, perhaps? Exposure to geological gas that causes hallucinations or irrational behavior? Could there have been infrasound, sounds below conscious human hearing, that some studies suggest can cause feelings of fear or discomfort? But subsequent tests of the area revealed no abnormal concentrations of gases or geological features that would generate infrasound at problematic levels. And even if such phenomena were present, it wouldn't explain why specifically they would cause the trio to remove their shoes and line them up before leaving. The uncomfortable truth that was emerging was that the case might not have an explanation that neatly fit into known categories of disappearances. And as the search prepared to resume with the morning light, with additional resources including sniffer dogs being mobilized, there was a tacit recognition among experienced investigators that they were dealing with something outside of normal experience, something that would challenge their ability to find answers, even with maximum effort. Comment below, no theory works. If you realize that when every conventional explanation fails to fully accommodate physical evidence, you are confronting a genuine mystery that resists easy categorization and demands consideration of possibilities beyond the usual. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because as the sun rose on the second day of the search, what was already a substantial operation transformed into one of the most massive search and rescue efforts Sequoia had witnessed in years. And when you understand the scale of resources that were eventually applied, when you see how many people dedicated days and weeks of exhaustive effort, when you consider all the technology that was mobilized, and then confront the result of absolutely nothing being found, you realize that we are not talking about an inadequate or poorly executed search. We are talking about 3 adults who disappeared so completely, so impossibly, that they defy all logic of how physical bodies occupy space and leave traces in a natural environment. The transformation from a local search effort to a regional mobilization happened gradually, as it became clear that the case would not be resolved quickly. By the second day, the number of active searchers had increased to 85 people, a combination of forest rangers, trained volunteers from multiple search and rescue organizations, and even police officers from neighboring jurisdictions who offered assistance. The search area expanded to 15 square kilometers, far beyond the distance a barefoot trio could reasonably have walked in the available time. But the operational principle was to assume nothing, verify everything. Teams scoured the terrain in meticulous grid patterns, walking, parallel lines spaced only a few meters apart, to ensure that no area was left unexamined. On the third day, sniffer dogs arrived, 3 teams of experienced handlers with certified dogs specifically trained to track missing persons. And what happened when the dogs were put to work added another layer of mystery that echoed disturbing patterns from other unexplained disappearances in national parks. Dogs were given items of clothing belonging to Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan that had been left in backpacks, establishing scent profiles. And all 3 dogs, working independently with different handlers, established trails clearly leading away from the campsite. The dogs' alert behavior was unmistakable. They had detected the scent and were following it. The handler's mindset as the dogs worked was one of cautious optimism. Finally, there was tangible progress. Trails were being followed. But then something disconcerting happened that left experienced handlers perplexed. Each of the 3 dogs in separate attempts over hours followed a trail for varying distances, between 200 and 400 meters from the camp, and then lost it completely. It wasn't the behavior of a dog reaching a fork in the trail and becoming confused about which direction to take. It wasn't the behavior of the trail being interrupted by water or rock, where scent molecules don't adhere well. It was an abrupt and complete loss of the trail, as if the people whose scent they were following simply ceased to exist at that specific point. Handlers meticulously checked areas where dogs had lost their scent, looking for features that would explain the interruption. There was a section of exposed rock in one location that could have hindered tracking, but in two other locations, there was nothing obvious that should have caused the scent to be lost. And critically, when dogs were taken beyond the points where they lost their scent and encouraged to search for scent re-establishment further on, they were unable to re-establish it. It was as if Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan had walked to those points and then evaporated, leaving zero scent molecules beyond that point that dogs with extraordinary olfactory abilities could detect. The impact of this pattern of dogs losing tracks at specific points was not lost on Patricia Morrison, who had studied David Polidei's work on mysterious disappearances in national parks. Anomalous canine behavior, specifically establishing an initial trail, but then losing it at a defined point without a clear reason, was one of the markers that Polidei had identified as recurring in particularly unexplained cases. And now the case of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan was exhibiting exactly the same pattern, adding to the growing database of disappearances that defy explanation through conventional scenarios. As the days passed, resources continued to be applied on a scale that demonstrated an absolute commitment to finding the trio. On the fifth day, drones with high-resolution cameras were flown in grid patterns over an expanded area, capturing footage of each section of forest from multiple angles and altitudes. Operators reviewed hours of video frame by frame, searching for any color or shape anomalies that could indicate human presence or belongings. Nothing was found. Thermal cameras mounted on helicopters made additional scans, this time expanding to a 10-kilometer radius from the camp, searching for heat signatures that would indicate living or recently deceased bodies. Multiple wildlife signatures were detected and investigated, but none proved to be human. The search operation also included forensic experts brought in to re-examine the camp itself using more advanced techniques. Lumino A test was applied to detect blood that might not be visible to the naked eye, a test that would reveal if there had been violence that cleaning had concealed. No blood was detected. Soil around the campsite was sifted, looking for small items that might have been left behind. Clothing buttons, pieces of jewelry, anything that could provide a clue. Nothing relevant was found. Analysis of campfire ash was conducted looking for burnt materials that shouldn't be there. Only normal wood and carbon. By the end of the first week, more than 200 people had participated in the search in some capacity. The area covered had expanded to approximately 50 square kilometers, and thousands of person-hours had been dedicated to scouring every inch of accessible ground. And the result was devastating statistics. Zero evidence of Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres, or Ryan Cooper had been found. No piece of clothing caught on a branch. No shoes or socks they could have taken off if injured feet became unbearable. No personal items they could have dropped. No sign that 3 adults had passed through an area that was being so intensively examined. The psychological truth of how search teams respond to prolonged failure is complex. There are stages that experienced searchers recognize. The first few days are characterized by high energy and optimism that the person will be found at any moment. As the days stretch into a week, energy remains, but optimism begins to be tempered by increasing realism about decreasing probabilities. After a week, especially in a case like this where there was no discovery, searchers begin to struggle with the frustration that heroic efforts are not producing results, mixed with a determination to continue because giving up would mean abandoning people who may still need help. Patricia Morrison witnessed this psychological transformation within the team and actively worked to maintain morale and focus. She conducted daily briefings where she acknowledged the difficulty of the search but emphasized the importance of continuing, of not leaving any area unchecked, of maintaining meticulous standards, even as hope dwindled. But in private conversations with other operations leaders, Patricia admitted to a perplexity that went beyond professional frustration. She couldn't construct a mental model of how the trio had disappeared so completely. Even in cases where bodies are never found, there is usually some evidence of direction of travel, some trail that can be followed even if it doesn't lead to the final discovery. But the case of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan seemed to violate this fundamental expectation. And then there were families whose emotional impact from days turning into weeks without news was devastating in a way that words can barely capture. Jennifer Torres and Carlos Torres, Melissa's parents, had driven from San Diego as soon as they learned their daughter was missing, arriving on the second day of the search. They established a presence in a hotel in a nearby town and came to the search area every day, keeping vigil, speaking with Patricia for updates, offering to help in any way possible, even when it was gently explained to them that family participation in active searches is generally not advisable for safety and emotional reasons. Jennifer Torres, Melissa's mother, would later describe in interviews how each day without news was a small death, hope being incrementally drained while simultaneously she was desperately unable to give up completely because, without a body, without conclusive evidence, there was always a tiny possibility that Melissa was alive somewhere, that a miracle could happen. She kept her phone charged and within reach. 24 hours a day, terrified of missing a call that would bring news, she looked at the photo of Melissa smiling around the campfire that Aaron had posted and searched for signs, for omens, for something that might have indicated that danger was near. There was nothing, just her happy daughter enjoying nature exactly as she should. Aaron's brother, Thomas Fletcher, arrived with a complete archive of Aaron's blog posts about hiking, thinking there might be clues in his writings about places he loved or routes he would follow. He went through each entry with investigators, marking locations on maps, trying to think like Aaron would. But Aaron had been meticulous about following established trails and camping in designated areas. Nothing in his writings suggested he would stray into uncharted territory. And anyway, Aaron wasn't alone. He was with Melissa and Ryan, and decisions would have been made as a group. Ryan Cooper's mother, Margaret Cooper, a widow and Ryan's only child, was perhaps the most devastated of all. She arrived in Sequoia visibly trembling, barely able to function through fear and grief. Margaret kept almost constant vigil near Search Command, refusing to go further than necessary to get a few hours of sleep before returning. She spoke to any returning searcher, asking about what they had seen, where they had looked, if there was any possibility that Ryan might be hiding or injured somewhere they hadn't yet checked. Searchers, touched by her obvious grief, vowed that they would not stop searching, that they would cover every inch until they had answers. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because while massive searches continued to scour the surrounding wilderness without success, a separate team of forensic experts was conducting meticulous analysis of the campsite itself, operating under the premise that the physical scene contained clues about what had happened, even if those clues weren't immediately obvious. And when you examine the revelations that emerged from this detailed forensic analysis, when you see how precisely they managed to reconstruct the timeline of the trio's activities in the hours before they disappeared, you realize that mystery isn't a lack of information, but the presence of information that tells a story impossible to reconcile with any rational explanation. The transformation of the campsite into an open-air forensic laboratory occurred on the fourth day, when it became clear that a wide-area search was not yielding results, and that perhaps answers lay in the details of the scene itself. A team of 3 forensic investigators specializing in crime scene analysis was brought in, not because there was necessarily suspicion of a crime, but because the techniques they used to meticulously examine scenes were exactly what the case required. They photographed the campsite from literally hundreds of angles, creating a comprehensive visual record before touching or moving anything. Then they began a systematic process of examining and documenting each element. Analysis of the campfire was particularly revealing. A specialist in wood-burning patterns brought in as a consultant examined firewood that had been burning when the hiking couple discovered the campsite. Based on charring patterns, the amount of ash accumulated, and the configuration of the logs, he determined that the campfire had been kept burning for an extended period, estimated at 8 to 10 hours. This suggested that someone had been feeding the fire overnight, periodically adding firewood to keep it burning, a.e. behavior consistent with experienced campers who keep the fire low throughout the night for both warmth and the psychological comfort of having light and the presence of fire in the wilderness. The mindset behind keeping a campfire burning overnight is understandable and common among campers. Fire provides warmth on cold mountain nights, serves as a deterrent for curious wildlife that generally avoids fire, and offers an immediate source of light if someone wakes up during the night and needs to orient themselves. Aaron, as an experienced camper, would have known these reasons and would have structured the campfire appropriately. And evidence confirmed that he or someone in the group had executed this task perfectly throughout the night. But then in the morning, additional firewood had been added, a substantial amount that would have kept the fire burning vigorously for several hours, far longer than would be necessary to simply prepare a quick breakfast. The impact of analyzing a pot of boiling water was to establish a very precise timeline of when the campsite was abandoned. Researchers conducted a controlled experiment, filling an identical pot with the same amount of water that the residual in the original pot indicated had been present, placing it over a fire of similar intensity, and timing how long it took for the water to boil to the level the original pot had reached. Based on the evaporation rate and ambient temperature that morning, they determined that the pot had been placed over the fire approximately 45 to 60 minutes before being discovered by David and Linda Martinez. This established that at some point between 7 and 7:15 a.m. on August 21st, someone from the trio had placed a pot of water on the campfire, presumably intending to prepare coffee or oatmeal or other food that required hot water. And then at some point, within the next 30 to 45 minutes, the trio abandoned camp without removing the pot or extinguishing the fire. The time window was narrow and specific, and what made it all the more perplexing was evidence that breakfast preparation was actively underway, not merely in its initial stages, but progressing through multiple steps that required attention and intention. Analysis of food found in the campfire area revealed details that painted a picture of a completely routine morning being executed methodically. 3 packets of instant oatmeal had been opened, their contents emptied into 3 different bowls, arranged in a line near the fire. Next to each bowl was a small pile of dried fruit and nuts, clearly prepared as toppings. There were spoons positioned near the bowls. There was a pour-over coffee filter, a device Aaron had mentioned in his blog as preferable to instant coffee, positioned on top of a large mug with a filter containing freshly ground coffee. The entire setting was that of people eating a meal they had eaten multiple times before, following an established routine without haste or signs of stress. The journey through footprint analysis around the campsite was conducted by a tracking specialist who had worked with law enforcement for decades, identifying movement patterns through marks on the ground. The soil in the camping area was partially soft, a combination of decomposed pine needles and earth, which retained impressions reasonably well. The specialist identified and catalogued 3 distinct sets of footprints corresponding to the shoe sizes of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan. The footprints showed normal movement of 3 people performing typical camping activities, walking between tent and campfire, walking to food container, and walking to an area designated as an improvised toilet away from the campsite. But what the footprints didn't show was just as revealing as what they did. There were no footprints of additional people besides the trio. There were no boot or shoe marks of different sizes or patterns from the 3 known sets. This ruled out the theory that strangers had arrived at the campsite and somehow interacted with the trio. And critically, the trio's barefoot footprints could be traced out of the immediate campsite area, but only for a few meters before the ground became too hard or covered in too dense vegetation to retain clear impressions. The general direction the footprints suggested led to no obvious trail or geographical feature, only into undifferentiated forest. The truth about what the luminol test revealed, or more precisely, what it didn't reveal, was significant in ruling out certain theories. Luminol is a chemical reagent that reacts with iron in hemoglobin, causing blood to glow with a characteristic blue light. Luminol is effective even when blood has been cleaned or is not visible to the naked eye. It is a standard tool in forensic investigations, when there is suspicion of violence that may have been concealed. Investigators systematically applied luminol throughout the campsite, including inside tents, around campfires and on surrounding ground. There was no positive reaction, indicating that no blood was present even in microscopic quantities. This eliminated the theory that violence had occurred at the campsite and strongly suggested that if something had happened to the trio, it did not involve physical trauma at the site itself. Analysis of the cell phones, once charged and examined by a digital forensics specialist, provided a window into the trio's mental state and activities in the hours before they disappeared. Aaron's iPhone showed last activity at 8:37 the previous evening, when he had checked email one last time before the signal disappeared completely. Emails were mundane, work confirmations, a message from his brother asking how his trip was going. Aaron had replied briefly, "Great so far, no signal but checking when I can. Pictures when I get back." Nothing in the tone or content suggested distress or concern. Melissa's phone showed that she had texted her mother at 8:14 the previous evening. "Hi Mom, amazing day today. We saw deer and a fawn near the campsite at dusk. Aaron made great dinner. Ryan is making us laugh with his student stories. Feeling so grateful for this time away from the hospital. Love you. See you in a few days." The message was warm and relaxed, exactly what you would expect from someone enjoying a happy vacation. Jennifer Torres would later say that she read that message hundreds of times, searching for subtext or a warning sign she should have noticed. But there was nothing but a happy daughter sharing a beautiful moment. Ryan's phone contained photos, the last one taken at 3:09 the previous night, an image of the sunset through trees with campfire flames visible in the foreground. It was a technically good photo. Ryan had crouched down to get an angle that captured both golden light filtered through the canopy and the warmth of the fire. There were other photos from the day. A selfie of a smiling trio on a trail, close-up of an interesting mushroom Melissa had found, a photo of a particularly massive sequoia they had hiked to see. All were exactly the kind of photos people on a happy camping trip would take, memories being created to share later. The impact of all the forensic analysis collectively painted an absolutely clear picture, until the morning of August 21st, when something inexplicable happened. The trip was progressing exactly as planned. The trio was happy, healthy, competently, and safely, performing camping activities, with no signs of stress, illness, interpersonal conflict, or any other factor that could foreshadow the irrational decision to abandon camp barefoot. And then, in a narrow window of time during routine breakfast preparation, something transformed a completely normal situation into an impenetrable mystery of 3 people disappearing without a trace other than lined-up shoes and a burning campfire. Patricia Morrison, reviewing compiled forensic reports, wrote in a case summary, "Forensic analysis eliminates multiple theories, but provides no alternative theory that explains the evidence. There was no violence at the campsite. There was no presence of strangers. There were no signs of psychological or physical distress prior to disappearance. The trio was performing a normal morning routine when something compelled them to leave immediately, but apparently not in panic, given the careful removal and alignment of their shoes. Motivation remains completely unknown, and the nature of something that compelled them remains a matter of speculation without conclusive evidence." It was a frustrating but honest admission that all the data in the world did not answer the fundamental question: what happened that morning that made 3 rational adults make such an inexplicable and fatal decision? And while forensic analysis was providing details but not answers, while wide area searches continued without success, and while families kept desperate vigil, no one could anticipate the impossible twist the case would take 5 months later, when one of the 3 would be found alive, in circumstances that would raise even more questions than they answered. Comment below. Forensics doesn't lie. If you understand that physical and digital evidence tells a clear story of normalcy up to the point of disappearance, making abrupt changes in behavior even more impossible to explain through gradual or predictable causes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after 2 weeks of intensive searches without any discovery, the operation was officially suspended in early September 2018, reduced to cold case status, with instructions that any new information would be immediately investigated, but active searching could not continue indefinitely. Families were devastated, but without choices, forced to return to their lives while carrying the pain of not knowing. And as months passed, as summer turned into autumn and then winter, it seemed that Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres, and Ryan Cooper had joined the growing list of people who simply disappeared in national parks without a trace. But then, on a cold morning in January 2019, 5 months after their disappearance, something happened that no one had anticipated. Ryan Cooper was found alive. The transformation from a cold case to a renewed active investigation occurred when a group of 3 backcountry skiers were navigating through a remote, mountainous area approximately 15 kilometers northeast of where their original camp had been, a distance well beyond the search perimeter that had been established in August. They were skiing through dense forest, covered in heavy snow, when one of them noticed something that seemed out of place, a flash of color that was neither snow white nor the brown of tree trunks. They skied closer to investigate and were shocked to discover a human being, a man, lying partially hidden under low branches of a large pine tree, his body curled up in a fetal position. Their initial thought was that they had found a body, a skier who had died from exposure or injury and whose body had been there indefinitely, preserved by the cold. But when they approached carefully and one of them touched the person's shoulder, it moved slightly and made a faint sound. The skier's mindset instantly shifted from documenting a gruesome discovery to performing an emergency rescue. One of them was a paramedic, with extensive training in wilderness medicine, and he immediately began assessing the man's condition, while another used a satellite communication device to call for emergency rescue, providing precise GPS coordinates. The man was conscious, but only marginally, able to open his eyes and make sounds but unable to form coherent words. He was wearing the same clothes that witnesses would later confirm Ryan had worn on the day of his disappearance, a t-shirt and hiking shorts, but the clothing was torn, dirty, and completely inadequate for the winter temperature, which was well below freezing. He had no coat, no gloves, no hat, and most surprisingly and disturbingly, his feet were bare, the skin necrotic from severe frostbite, his toes in multiple stages of frostbite that would clearly require amputation. The impact of the medical rescue team arriving by helicopter within 40 minutes was life-saving for Ryan because he was suffering from severe hypothermia with a body temperature that had dropped to a dangerously low level, extreme malnutrition with an estimated weight loss of 20 to 25 kilograms, and multiple infections related to untreated injuries. He was stabilized on site sufficiently for transport, then evacuated to a hospital in Fresno, where he was immediately placed in intensive care. Doctors would later say it was almost miraculous that he had survived 5 months in the wilderness during the transition from summer to winter without proper shelter, adequate food or footwear. News that Ryan Cooper had been found alive spread quickly, reaching families who had spent months in agony not knowing. Margaret Cooper, Ryan's mother, was in utter shock mixed with overwhelming relief that her son was alive, tempered by horror at the condition in which he was found. She immediately traveled to Fresno and did not leave Ryan's side as he slowly recovered through days in intensive care. Jennifer and Carlos Torres, Melissa's parents, felt a complex mix of renewed hope that if Ryan survived, perhaps Melissa might also be alive, mixed with growing fear as it became clear that Ryan was alone when found. Ryan's journey from an unconscious critical patient to one stable enough to be interviewed took a week, and when he was finally able to speak, when Patricia Morrison and a specialist investigator were authorized by doctors to ask gentle, non-confrontational questions, the story Ryan told was fragmented, confused, and raised far more questions than it answered. He spoke in broken sentences, sometimes stopping mid-thought as if he had lost his train of thought, occasionally contradicting something he had said minutes before. Doctors explained that the combination of extreme physical trauma, possible psychological trauma, and 5 months of deprivation could absolutely affect memory and cognitive ability. Ryan claimed, in the most coherent version of the story he was able to articulate through multiple interviews, that on the morning of August 21st, the trio was preparing breakfast when they heard a sound coming from the woods. He described the sound as resembling a child crying or calling for help, a distressing quality that immediately caught the attention of all three. Aaron had said something like, "Are you hearing that?" and they all confirmed that they could hear it. The sound seemed to be coming from a specific direction, perhaps 100 meters into the woods beyond the campsite. The trio briefly discussed whether they should investigate, worried that perhaps a child from another camping family had gotten lost and was in distress. The mindset Ryan described at that moment was one of moral obligation to check, that if there was a possibility someone needed help, they had to investigate even if it turned out to be nothing. But then Ryan said something that made no sense, and that he couldn't adequately explain when pressed. He claimed that all three had needed to remove their shoes before going to investigate the sound. When asked why they needed to do this, Ryan became visibly agitated and confused, saying that it seemed important at the time and that it had to be done that way, but he couldn't articulate a logical reason. It was as if the action had made perfect sense at the time, but in retrospect it was inexplicable even to himself. Ryan described the trio then leaving camp barefoot, following the sound through the forest. He said the sound continued, always seeming to be a little further ahead, leading them deeper into the wilderness. And then Ryan's story became even more fragmented and inconsistent. He couldn't explain how long they had walked or how far they had gone. He couldn't coherently describe what had happened next or when he had lost contact with Aaron and Melissa. He insisted he didn't remember intentionally separating from them, but then he was alone and couldn't find them when he called out. The most disturbing truth that Ryan repeated multiple times, always with the same confusion and fear in his eyes, was that at some point the process of following sound changed, that he realized something was wrong about the whole situation, but couldn't stop continuing. He used the word compelled several times, saying he felt as if he had no choice but to keep following, even when the rational part of his brain was screaming that he should return to camp. It was a description of experience that sounded almost like possession or external control of will, a concept that made researchers deeply uncomfortable because it didn't fit into the framework of rational explanations. When asked about the 5 months between his disappearance and being found, Ryan's memory was even more fragmented. He had flashes of being in different locations, searching for food, being desperately cold and hungry, but he couldn't construct a linear narrative or timeline. He couldn't explain how he had survived for so long in conditions that should have been fatal within weeks, if not days. He couldn't explain where specifically he had been, or whether he had moved through different areas or remained in one general location. And most frustratingly for everyone involved, he couldn't provide any useful information about where Aaron and Melissa might be, insisting that he didn't know where they were, that he had lost contact with them at some early point and never saw them again. The psychological impact of interviews on Ryan was visible. He became increasingly agitated as questions continued, occasionally breaking down in tears when asked about Aaron and Melissa, repeating, I don't know, I should know, but I don't know," with genuine despair. A clinical psychologist brought in to assess, Ryan concluded that he was not deliberately lying, but that a combination of trauma and possibly dissociative experience during the original event had created genuine gaps in his memory that he could not voluntarily fill. The recommendation was that Ryan needed substantial time for physical recovery and psychological therapy before any further attempts to extract more detailed memories. Renewed searches were immediately launched, focusing on a 15-kilometer area around where Ryan was found, operating under the theory that Aaron and Melissa might be nearby. But winter had dramatically transformed the terrain. Heavy snow covered everything, and if there were any traces of Aaron or Melissa, they were buried by spring. And as weeks of winter searches yielded no discoveries, and as spring eventually arrived, allowing for more comprehensive searches that still found nothing, a painful realization set in that Ryan was likely the sole survivor, and that Aaron Fletcher and Melissa Torres would never be found. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because years after that August morning when the trio disappeared, and months after Ryan was found alive but unable to provide complete answers, the case's status remains officially unsolved and deeply disturbing for everyone involved. Ryan Cooper survived physically, although he lost 3 toes to frostbite and bears permanent scars from malnutrition and prolonged exposure. But psychological survival has been a far more complex and painful journey. And Aaron Fletcher and Melissa Torres were never found, Despite extensive renewed searches after Ryan's discovery, despite families holding on to hope for years, despite every possible lead being followed to frustrating conclusions of nowhere. Ryan's transformation from an enthusiastic teacher and loyal friend into a traumatized individual grappling with survivors' guilt and fragmented memories of an inexplicable experience has been devastating to witness for those who know him. He spent months in physical rehabilitation, followed by years of psychological therapy, working with trauma specialists who attempted to help him process what happened and reconcile gaps in memory with a need to understand and move on. But Ryan developed a deep reluctance to discuss the event publicly, refusing media interviews, avoiding contact with the community of people interested in mysterious disappearances, and building a private life where the Sequoia experience is something he tries not to think about daily. Close friends of Ryan report that he hasn't gone camping since the experience, that he avoids even casual discussions about hiking or national parks, and that he reacts visibly with discomfort if someone mentions strange or inexplicable sounds in nature. He returned to teaching after 2 years, finding some measure of purpose and normalcy in working with students, but colleagues note a persistent sadness in him that wasn't there before, the weight of unanswered questions and the loss of 2 friends that he can't fully explain or process. And crucially, he carries massive guilt for having survived when Aaron and Melissa didn't, constantly questioning why he was spared and what he could have done differently. Margaret Cooper, Ryan's mother, has a mindset of profound gratitude that her son is alive, mixed with the pain of seeing his psychological suffering and the frustration of not being able to protect him or make sense of what happened. She has become a vocal advocate for more research into phenomena that may affect human behavior in wilderness, arguing that if there is something about certain locations or circumstances that can compel people to make irrational decisions, the public needs to know about it in order to protect themselves. But she also respects Ryan's desire for privacy and doesn't press for details that he clearly finds painful to discuss. For Aaron and Melissa's families, the reality is even crueler because they have neither survivors nor bodies, only a permanent absence without closure. Aaron's brother, Thomas Fletcher, has organized multiple private search expeditions over the years, hiring experienced guides and using his own equipment to scour areas where he thinks Aaron might have gone based on knowledge of his brother's preferences. None of these searches have yielded any findings. Thomas maintains a memorial website for Aaron where he posts updates on ongoing search efforts and keeps alive the hope that one day there will be answers, but it is a hope that becomes progressively more tenuous with each passing year. The impact on Jennifer and Carlos Torres has been particularly devastating because Melissa was their only child, and their relationship with her was extraordinarily close. Jennifer describes the experience of living with the ambiguity of a missing person as being trapped in limbo where she can't fully grieve because part of her refuses to accept that Melissa is dead without definitive evidence, but also can't move on because each day brings the theoretical possibility of news. They transformed Melissa's room into something between a memorial and a time capsule, keeping everything exactly as it was when she left for her trip to Sequoia, creating a space where they can feel close to her even in her absence. The journey to understand what the calling from the forest that Ryan described truly means has been the source of extensive debate among investigators, psychologists, and researchers of anomalous phenomena. There are basically 3 categories of theory. It was something real and external that the trio heard. It was a collective auditory hallucination caused by some environmental factor, or it was a construction of Ryan's traumatized memory that does not accurately reflect what actually happened. Each category has proponents, but also significant problems. If the calling was real, what was it? There was no other person in distress in the area. Searches found no evidence of a missing child or another camper needing help. Could it have been an animal making a sound that the trio misinterpreted as human? Some animals, like pumas, can make sounds that are occasionally described as sounding human, but experienced rangers in the region didn't find it likely that the experienced trio would confuse animal vocalization with a child in distress, especially not so convincingly that all 3 would respond by going barefoot to investigate. The theory of collective auditory hallucination is intriguing because there are scientific precedents for natural phenomena that can affect human perception in ways that affected individuals do not consciously recognize. Infrasound, sound at frequencies below approximately 20 Hz, which is below conscious human hearing, has been studied for causing sensations of discomfort, anxiety, and even hallucinations in some people. Infrasound can be generated by multiple natural sources, including wind through specific geological formations, minor seismic activity, and even groundwater movement. And there are documented cases of people reporting sensations of presence, strange sounds, or feelings of fear in locations where infrasound was present at high levels. But teams that returned to the campsite later and conducted measurements did not detect abnormal levels of infrasound, although they acknowledged that conditions may have been different on that specific August morning, depending on factors such as wind and atmospheric pressure. And even if infrasound was present, theory does not fully explain why specifically the trio would carefully remove their shoes before investigating, an action that seems to require deliberate thought processes inconsistent with a panic response or hallucination. The truth about the possibility that Ryan's memory of calling is a retrospective construct, the brain trying to make sense of gaps in memory by creating a narrative that fills in voids, even if the narrative isn't completely accurate, also has psychological merit. Human memory, especially traumatic memory, is notoriously malleable and subject to distortion. It's possible that something completely different happened that Ryan can't consciously access, and calling from the forest is the way his subconscious mind found to explain why the trio left camp. But this theory is impossible to prove or disprove without access to Aaron and Melissa to confirm or contradict Ryan's version. There is also disturbing consideration of precedents, other cases where campsites were found similarly abandoned, with evidence of departure that appears to have been hurried but not violent. David Paulides' research on patterns of disappearances in national parks identified at least 7 cases over decades where campsites were found with campfires still burning or recently extinguished, belongings left behind, including sometimes shoes, and occupants missing without clear explanation. In 2 of these cases, survivors were eventually found with fragmented accounts of having heard or seen something that compelled them to leave, descriptions that echo Ryan's account, but with specific variations. The impact of this pattern is to suggest that perhaps there is a genuine phenomenon not yet fully understood by science that under specific circumstances can affect human perception and judgment in ways that lead to irrational and dangerous decisions. It is not a satisfactory explanation because it does not identify a specific mechanism or way to prevent or protect against it, but it does acknowledge that discarding, to dismiss all these cases as coincidence or to explain each one individually through unique circumstances, ignores a pattern that deserves serious scientific investigation. Patricia Morrison, who eventually retired from the National Park Service, gave an interview years later where she reflected on the case. In decades of working in wilderness, I've seen many tragedies, many accidents, many errors of judgment that led to disappearances or deaths. But the case of Aaron Fletcher, Melissa Torres, and Ryan Cooper remains unique in my experience because of the combination of elements that simply don't fit into the framework of how people disappear. An abandoned campsite with everything left behind, shoes deliberately removed, survivor testimony of being compelled by something they can't adequately explain, and the fact that 2 of the 3 people were never found despite massive resources applied. It's a case that makes me question whether we understand wilderness as well as we think we do, whether there are aspects of the interaction between humans and nature that our current science hasn't captured. And this reflection captures the fundamental dilemma of the case. How much mystery truly remains, not only about the specific details of that morning in Sequoia, but about the fundamental nature of what is possible in national parks we visit, assuming they are comprehensible environments governed by rules we know. Because if Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan were victims of something we don't understand, something that can compel rational people to make decisions that violate survival instincts, then how many other people over the years might have been affected by the same phenomenon? And more importantly, how do we protect ourselves against threats we cannot name, detect, or fully comprehend? Comment below. We need answers. If you believe that cases like this deserve more serious scientific investigation instead of being dismissed as unsolvable mysteries, because perhaps there are truths about national parks and human interaction with wilderness that we still need to discover. If you've made it this far, to this final point in the story of Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan, and the abandoned campsite with its campfire still burning, it's because you understand that there are mysteries in national parks that go far beyond people simply getting lost or making bad decisions. These are cases involving disturbing patterns, physical evidence that tells impossible stories, and survivors like Ryan who carry fragmented memories of experiences that defy rational explanation. If you've ever had a camping experience where you heard sounds you couldn't identify, felt an inexplicable compulsion to go in a specific direction, or felt instinct scream that something was profoundly wrong without any articulate reason, leave a comment below. I heard the call. These 3 words show that you recognize that there may be phenomena in wilderness that our science doesn't yet fully understand, that experiences like the trios are not unique even if they are rarely discussed publicly. And your specific experiences shared here help to map out patterns that deserve more serious investigation. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring cases of disappearances in national parks that are meticulously documented but defy conventional explanation. Every week we delve into these stories with respect for the victims and their families, paying attention to emerging patterns and committed to never sensationalizing real tragedy, but also never ignoring genuine mysteries just because they are uncomfortable to confront. Like this video, if Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan's story touched you, if the still burning campfire and aligned shoes made you question what else might be happening in places we visit, assuming we fully understand, it's your way of saying that investigations like this, which treat both physical evidence and unexplained experiences with seriousness, deserve to exist and reach more people who need to know these stories before their next wilderness trip. There's a video here about other cases of abandoned campsites found under mysterious circumstances, including specific patterns that repeat across decades and multiple national parks, revealing what may be a systematic phenomenon that authorities prefer not to discuss publicly. If you want to continue this journey of understanding uncomfortable truths about national parks, click and continue with me there. If you plan to camp in a national park, take seriously not only physical preparation and appropriate equipment, but also pay attention to instincts and sensations that you can't rationally explain. If something about the area makes you feel you should leave, if you hear sounds that seem to compel investigation but also make you uncomfortable, trust your instinct for self-preservation instead of curiosity. Aaron, Melissa, and Ryan were experienced campers who knew safety rules but still made a decision we can't fully explain. Don't become the next story we investigate. Thank you for being here, for caring about these cases, for recognizing that there is much about wilderness that we still don't understand. See you on the next investigation, and please, stay safe out there.